Hello, scholars. Today we're going to explore what invasive species are and how they impact the environment. So we're going to answer the questions, what exactly are invasive species and how do they affect other living things in the environment? First, let's review some important terms we need to know to better understand what invasive species are and how they affect other living things. So last week, we talked about three main ways that living things interact with each other. Pause the video now and see if you can remember the three main ways that living things interact with one another. You were right if you remembered that the interactions between living things can be positive, negative, and neutral. Kiss your brain. So let's start out with positive interactions. So positive interactions between living things, between both plants and animals, can be positive when both living things benefit from the relationship. We also call this mutualism. For example, some birds like to stay around hippos and other large animals to eat insects and other bits of food from the bodies of the large animals. So the birds get a free meal, and the big animals like the hippo here gets a free cleaning. So both are happy, both get to benefit from that relationship. Now, negative interactions. Negative interactions can include predator and prey, when one animal hunts another animal to eat it for food. Also, negative interactions include competition, like we talked about last week. So members of the same species or different species can compete for the same food, for the same territory, and other resources that are limited. So I want you to think of any other negative interaction between living things that you can think of. So pause the video and jot down at least one or two other ways that living things would interact in a negative way. Did you think of any more? One way you may have thought about is when one animal or living thing is a parasite to another living thing. Just like mosquitoes or fleas that feed on the blood of animals would be an example of parasites. So that's another negative interaction you might think of. So the third and final way are neutral interactions between living things. So when things are neutral between living things, both animals or plants are not affected and don't really seem to mind the other one. So they don't really benefit from the other one, but they also are not harmed by the other one. A neutral interaction, like this llama here and the horse, they both eat pretty much the same type of food, but there's plenty of food to go around. So neither one really minds the other one being around. So that slide, or this now brings us to what we're going to focus on today, invasive species. What exactly are invasive species? Before we answer that together, I want you to imagine a big island with lots of trees and bushes and plants. Now imagine that island has a lot of animals and plants that have lived there for a very long time. So they're predators and prey, just like any ecosystem. The owls eat the mice, the foxes hunt for rabbits, the rabbits and mice eat the plants on the island. Everything works together in a healthy, balanced ecosystem. They all depend on each other for survival, and there's overall a pretty healthy balance. Now, I want you to imagine that a boat shows up and the people on the boat don't realize that a species of giant rat sneaks off the boat onto the island, and these rats happen to be very hungry and big eaters. They can eat almost anything. They're also too large for most of the predators on the island to eat as their food. So in a short amount of time, a lot of these rats are spreading over the whole island. So what do you think would happened to the living things, the other living things on that island? Pause the video and think about what are some impacts that those rats would have on the ecosystem of the island. Okay, so what do you think would be a good definition for an invasive species? In our example of the island, there's two things we need to really be clear on before we can fully give a good definition for an invasive species. On our island, the animals and plants that have lived there for a really long time we would call the native species. So native species are living things that have lived in an environment for a long time. What might help you remember this is just remembering like Native Americans. Remember, before any European settlers came to America, the people that lived here originally for a long, long time were Native Americans. So when we say an animal's native habitat, we're talking about what is the place where they have lived for a very long time. So the non-native species are any species that are introduced to a new ecosystem that haven't normally lived there for a long time. So an invasive species is not native to that area. It gets introduced to a new ecosystem. And if that species is better at getting food and avoiding predators than other living things that live there, then it may spread and become what we call invasive species. So that brings us to a pretty good definition of an invasive species is a living thing that is introduced to an ecosystem and it spreads quickly and disrupts the normal balance of the ecosystem there. In other words, an invasive species is a non-native species of living thing that takes over an ecosystem after it is introduced. All right, so now I'm going to do a quick example report of a native species. Before I kind of give you an example of what you are going to do with one of your invasive species you choose, let's read together the criteria for success. So I'll read each one. The criteria for success for the invasive species report. Number 1, identify the name and the native habitat of the invasive species that you choose. 2, describe the ecosystem your species has invaded. And 3, explain how this species has disrupted the native ecosystem. So let's look at an example together. I did some research on the Burmese python. I'll show you exactly in a second on Google Classroom where to find this assignment. It's called the Invasive Species Report. But first let's quickly look at, here we go. The invasive species I chose to look at is the Burmese python. So these Burmese pythons, and you might not get to see the whole article, but hopefully you can see enough. The Burmese python are giant snakes that were originally pets of people in South Florida. And some of these people, after they got tired of having their pet snake or it got too big for its cage, they just let it go outside. And what happened is those snakes spread throughout the Florida Everglades and now are causing major problems to the ecosystem in South Florida. So these giant pythons that used to be pets have now started eating everything from birds to larger prey and sometimes have even driven species near to extinction. So to do my report, what I'm going to do, I go to our Google Classroom. This is 4B's page. So I'm going to go down to Classwork, Science, and we see Invasive Species Report. So you will see you have 4 different living things to choose from that are invasive species. You can do the zebra mussels, kudzu, lionfish, or wild pigs. And you'll read those articles, or one of those articles of your choice, and then you're going to click on the Google Docs here, Invasive Species Report. So I already wrote a few notes. I will leave for you, when you open your document, you will see the Invasive Species Report, name, and a place to write which species you chose. And also you're going to see a heading, just like the CFS points out, the native habitat, the ecosystem that's invaded, and the impact on that ecosystem. So after I put my name, I did my report on the Burmese Python, and I already included some information that I wrote down. I took notes on a piece of paper as I read my article about the Burmese Python. Remember, I was paying close attention to what is the native habitat, what ecosystem was invaded, and what is the impact on that ecosystem. So that's what I was looking for as I read and took notes. I wrote, the Burmese python is native to parts of Asia, including India and Lower China. It lives in the jungles there and feeds on a number of rodents, birds, and other reptiles. I might add a little more, maybe about the climate of that habitat. The climate of the jungles there is very humid. That means a lot of moisture in the air, and hot. This is a similar climate to South Florida. So the Burmese python was perfectly adapted already to thrive in the Everglades where it invaded. So that's the next section. Burmese pythons have invaded the Florida Everglades. Everglades are a hot, swampy part of lower Florida. Saltwater and freshwater combine to make brackish water, a mix of the two. So another part of the ecosystem, remember, ecosystem is talking about the living thing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what type of animals live in the Everglades already. Many types of animals live in the Everglades. We might always think of alligators when we think of Everglades. So including alligators, snakes, fish. Remember, you're going to be a little more detailed and look specifically for the information, and mammals such as large rodents. So those are all important for the pythons to eat. Now this last section is really important. This is what I want you to really focus on. The impact on the ecosystem. They're not picky. Burmese pythons are not picky eaters. They eat pretty much any animal they can fit in their mouth. From tiny songbirds to adult deer, they can grow to be 26 feet long and weigh 200 pounds. Because they eat so many different animals and get so big, they have caused many species of birds and mammals to die off quickly, including some endangered species. You're going to talk about exactly how that invasive species has impacted the environment and invaded. If you have any questions, you can always add those to comments on the assignment itself, and I'll try to answer those as soon as I can. Otherwise, have fun with this. I want you to really explore your invasive species. You can do some additional research just by typing in Google the name of your species, and I look forward to reading all of your great reports.